They say justice is blind, but what if it just refuses to look at you? Hi, everyone. I hope this finds you and your family in peace and health and surrounded by love, because the story I'm about to share isn't just a legal battle. It's about a system that turns its back and a woman who stood up, not just for her brother, but for every voice drowned out by power. Her name is Danielle Brooks, and this is how she brought the courtroom and the country to its knees. Danielle walked into that courtroom with a calm that didn't come from peace. It came from war. A war she'd already fought in her heart. Because this wasn't just another case. This was her brother, her blood. She scanned the room. Polished wood benches, tight-lipped strangers, whispers behind hands, and overhead, that invisible weight of judgment pressing down on everything. But Danielle didn't flinch. To most people, this was just a courtroom. To her, a battlefield. And she wasn't here to beg. She was here to fight. At the defense table sat Malcolm Brooks, her older brother, once the dreamer of their family, the man who believed in doing right, in treating people with dignity. But today he was slouched, hollow, barely holding himself together. His hands were clenched on the table, his eyes fixed on the floor. His spirit looked like it had been dragged through hell. Danielle's heart twisted. She remembered when they were kids, how Malcolm used to tell her stories at bedtime, how he always made her laugh, how he protected her, and now he needed her to protect him. She leaned over, her voice barely a whisper. "Malcolm, you're not alone in this. I'm here and I'm not leaving." He turned slightly, his voice cracked. They don't care about the truth." Danielle gripped his hand, firm, steady. "Then we'll make them care." At that moment, the courtroom doors groaned open. Every head turned, and in walked Judge Leonard Graves. He didn't just enter, he commanded the room. Black robe flowing behind him like he thought he was royalty. Chin up, eyes sharp, ego thicker than the gavel he carried. He didn't just look at people, he assessed them, like he was deciding who deserved to breathe the same air as him. Graves had a reputation, and not a good one. He was feared, not respected, known for ruling with an iron tongue and a bias that didn't even bother to hide. People whispered about him, but no one ever dared challenge him until today. He took his seat, leaned back with an air of smug control. His fingers tapped the bench like a bored king waiting for his entertainment. And then he looked at Danielle. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "So," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "you think you know the law better than I do?" The room held its breath. Danielle didn't blink. She didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't flinch. She stared right back. She'd already faced worse. Graves was used to breaking people down with just a glance. But this time, he'd met a wall, and across the aisle, the man who would try to break her brother's future stood up. Marcus Lowell, the prosecutor, starched suit, cold eyes, voice like silk wrapped around a knife. He stood with theatrical confidence, scanning the jury like they were pawns on his personal chessboard. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, each syllable sharpened for effect. "This is not a case of misunderstanding. It is not a case of overreaction. This is a case of defiance." He walked the room like it was a stage. The defendant, he pointed toward Malcolm, chose not to cooperate, chose to escalate, and now he wants to claim he's the victim. He paused. Let the silence do the work. "No," he continued, now addressing the jury directly, "the true victims are the officers who put their lives on the line and were met with hostility and aggression." Danielle could feel Malcolm's body tense beside her, his shoulders stiff, his fingers curling into the wood of the table. She placed a hand over his. "You're not alone. Don't break now." Her touch said it all. Lowell paced again, this time slower. "This isn't just about one man resisting arrest," he said. "It's about what happens when we allow people to undermine law and order. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what's truly on trial today." But he never mentioned the video, the one that showed Malcolm being shoved, pinned, knee to the spine while doing nothing wrong. Lowell knew it, but he also knew how to manipulate a jury. Danielle saw it all, the twisted narrative, the performance. She wasn't impressed. As Lowell returned to his seat, he sent Danielle a smug look, but she didn't blink. Her time was coming, and she would not waste it. The air in the courtroom was thick, like waiting for a storm to hit. Every movement felt louder, the shuffle of papers, the creak of old benches. Even breaths seemed like interruptions. At the defense table, Malcolm Brooks sat still, but inside he was unraveling. His hands were balled into fists. His back was ramrod straight, but his eyes, they stared dead at the polished wood in front of him, like it was the only thing holding him together. Nobody else could see it, but Danielle could. The slight tremble in his fingers, the twitch in his jaw every time Marcus Lowell's voice echoed off the walls. Malcolm was reliving that night, over and over. The flashing lights, the sharp commands, the shove, violent and sudden. He hadn't fought, he hadn't resisted. But none of that seemed to matter now. All anyone in this courtroom saw was another black man in a defendant's seat. Danielle sat beside him, calm on the surface. But inside, she was burning. Every smug glance from Lowell, every dismissive sneer from Judge Graves, every sideways whisper from the audience. They were like gasoline on her fire. Across the room, Judge Graves reclined like a bored god, arms draped over the bench, his gaze flat. When the defense attorney spoke, he barely looked up. But when Lowell addressed the jury, he leaned in, eyes sharp, smirk ready. The bias wasn't subtle. Marcus Lowell stood again, voice smooth as ever. "Let's be clear," he said, addressing the jury as if he were talking to children. "This isn't about one man. This is about the very structure of justice, about what happens when people believe they're above the law." He turned toward Malcolm. Mr. Brooks didn't just make a mistake, he made a choice to defy authority. Danielle's fist tightened in her lap, her nails pressed into her palms. "This case isn't about color, it's about conduct," Lowell said, with that polished, manufactured sincerity. "And conduct has consequences." Malcolm stared down, shoulders tight, his voice barely a breath. "They've already made up their minds, Danielle. Doesn't matter what we say." Danielle leaned closer, speaking just for him. "Don't you dare give up. We've come too far, and I know who you are. You're not what they say." Malcolm didn't answer right away, but his shoulders softened, just slightly. A flicker of something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there all morning. Hope. The jury sat like statues, faces unreadable. Some leaned in, some leaned back. Spectators whispered behind cupped hands. Some looked at Malcolm with pity, others with suspicion. Danielle could feel it all, the weight of being seen and yet dismissed. Could she change his fate in a courtroom where the odds were stacked from the moment they walked in? She didn't know, but she was damn sure going to try. She drew in a deep breath, straightened her back, and rose. Every head turned as she walked toward the witness stand, each step slow, firm, deliberate. She adjusted the microphone, took a steady breath, her face calm, her posture steel. Then came the interruption. "Miss Brooks," Judge Graves said, cutting in before she spoke, "let's not waste the court's time with emotional appeals. Do you have facts or just feelings?" Danielle didn't break eye contact. "Your Honor, She said, her tone even, measured. "I'm here to present the facts, nothing else." Graves gave a little mocking wave. "Then proceed, quickly," Danielle began. She laid out the events of the night, the calm tone of Malcolm's voice, his compliance, the officer's sudden escalation, every word carefully chosen, every sentence anchored in truth. But before she could continue, "Objection," Lowell shot up. "She's his sister. She's not objective." Graves didn't hesitate. "Sustained." "Miss Brooks, stick to the relevant facts, not your personal interpretation." Danielle bit down the fire rising in her throat. "The fact," she said through gritted teeth, "is that my brother was forced to the ground with no provocation." Graves cut in again, sharper this time. "That video evidence you refer to has already been reviewed, and as the prosecution noted, it's inconclusive. Let's move on." Lowell stepped in again, like a hawk swooping in. "Your Honor, this case is about accountability. The defendant disregarded lawful orders, and he must be held responsible." He shot Danielle a look as he returned to his seat. That arrogant look of, "I've already won." Danielle sat down beside Malcolm. She didn't speak, but her silence was louder than anything else in that room because she wasn't done, not by a long shot. Malcolm Brooks sat there, silent, still, but far from okay. His hands rested on the table, clenched so tightly that the blood had all but disappeared from his knuckles. His back was straight, but only because he was holding himself up with every last thread of pride he had left. To the casual observer, he looked composed, but Danielle knew the truth. He was unraveling. When she returned to her seat after the judge's second interruption, she caught the faintest shake of Malcolm's head. His lips barely moved. "It doesn't matter, Dee. I'm just another case to them. Another statistic." Her chest tightened. The confident, protective brother she had grown up idolizing now sounded like a man who'd already written his own ending. Danielle placed her hand gently over his. "Don't say that." Her voice was low but firm. "You're not a number. You're not just some file in a drawer. You're my brother, and I'm not giving up on you." He looked at her then, eyes glassy, mouth trembling. "But they don't care about the truth. You saw how they cut you off, how they twist everything. What's the point?" Danielle's grip on his hand tightened. "The point is, I know who you are, and I know what's right. They can ignore me, they can distort everything, but it won't change what really happened." She leaned closer, just enough so he could feel her breath. "We're not done, Malcolm, not even close." And right then something shifted. His breathing slowed, his fingers loosened, and for the first time since that courtroom session began, Malcolm looked like he wasn't sinking. It was barely a flicker of hope, but it was there. Danielle saw it, and it lit something in her too. "I know this feels impossible," she said softly, "and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But the truth, it doesn't die in silence, it breaks through, eventually." Malcolm didn't say a word. He just nodded, slowly. But that nod, that was everything. Danielle gave his hand one last squeeze, then stood up again, not to speak this time, but to act. All eyes followed her as she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. Her movement was slow, controlled, purposeful, and then she pulled it out. A black leather badge wallet. She flipped it open. The gold emblem of the United States Secret Service gleamed in the fluorescent light. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. "My name is Special Agent Danielle Brooks," she said, her voice clear and deliberate. "I'm not just a witness. I'm a federal agent, and it is my sworn duty to protect justice." Time froze. Judge Leonard Graves blinked once. His jaw twitched, his authority shaken. He straightened in his chair, his voice clipped. Agent Brooks, the miss quickly forgotten. Your credentials are impressive, but they do not give you authority in my courtroom. Danielle didn't flinch. With respect, Your Honor, she replied calmly, I'm not here to overstep. I'm here to ensure that the truth isn't buried beneath bias and bureaucracy. Across the aisle, Marcus Lowell stiffened, his jaw clenched. Then, forcing a casual chuckle, he stood. Your Honor, he said, trying to sound unbothered. While Agent Brooks's background is commendable, it does not erase her connection to the defendant. She's still his sister. Her testimony is subjective. But the courtroom energy had already shifted. The jurors leaned in. Spectators murmured behind their hands. Even the stenographer seemed more alert. Lowell's voice cracked just slightly at the end of his sentence. Danielle stood tall, her badge still in hand, the gold catching light like a weapon of truth. I've spent years chasing down lies, investigating corruption, and defending this country's leaders, she said, turning toward the jury. And I won't sit down and let the same injustice happen in front of me now. The room buzzed, whispers, awed glances, a collective realization that this wasn't just a sister on a witness stand anymore. This was a federal agent, and she had receipts. Judge Graves banged his gavel. Order, this court will maintain order. But even he couldn't drown out the truth now. Danielle turned to the defense attorney and gave a short nod. And then the lights dimmed slightly as the projector hummed to life. All eyes turned to the screen at the front of the courtroom. The video began. Rainy, grainy footage, but clear enough. A police car, flashing lights, Malcolm stepping out, hands visible, calm, no yelling, no sudden movements. And then the officer, shouting, shoving, Malcolm hitting the pavement hard, hands pinned, a knee pressed into his spine. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, audible and raw. Danielle stood again. If I may, Your Honor, she said, eyes fixed on the screen. Judge Graves paused, tight-lipped, then nodded once. Danielle walked slowly to the screen and pointed. Here, she said. Malcolm is calm, his hands are visible, he's complying. There is no sign of resistance, and yet he's attacked. The room held its breath. She let the footage play again, slower this time. This isn't arrest protocol, Danielle continued, voice rising just enough. It's an assault. And not just against my brother, but against everyone who's ever been told to stay silent when they know they've done nothing wrong. The video kept rolling, the officer shouting accusations, Malcolm still on the ground, still not fighting back. Danielle pointed again. He's not moving, not resisting, just trying to stay alive. And yet, the aggression escalates. The jury leaned in, some with their hands to their mouths, some with brows furrowed in disgust, some whispering to each other, eyebrows raised. The truth had just become undeniable. Danielle took a breath, then looked across the room. This is more than a video, it's a mirror, she said, and we all have to ask ourselves what we're willing to accept. She turned toward the jury. This isn't just about Malcolm Brooks, it's about justice, and whether or not we're brave enough to protect it, especially when it's not convenient. The courtroom was silent. No one moved, no one whispered. The only sound was the soft, constant ticking of the old clock on the far wall, each second stretching like an eternity. Danielle Brooks sat down slowly beside her brother, her posture calm, her face unreadable. But inside, her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. Malcolm's hands were gripping the edge of the defense table, his knuckles bone white, his breath shallow. His eyes locked on the jury box, but he wasn't really seeing it. He was listening for the one thing that could either set him free or bury him. Across the room, the jury foreperson stood, a folded slip of paper in hand, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The bailiff took the paper, walked it over to Judge Leonard Graves, who adjusted his robe with a practiced, rigid motion. Graves read the verdict quietly first. Something flickered across his face. Was it surprise? Was it resistance? He looked up. "Will the defendant please rise?" Malcolm's legs felt like stone. Danielle stood with him, one hand behind his back steadying him. The foreperson cleared her throat. "On the charge of resisting arrest," a pause, one heartbeat, two. "We find the defendant, Malcolm Brooks, not guilty." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. For half a second, no one breathed. And then, a wave of gasps, soft applause, murmurs of, "Oh my God," and they did it. The tension that had gripped the courtroom for hours, weeks, seemed to lift all at once. Spectators exhaled. Some nodded through tears. Others just sat in stunned silence. Malcolm stood frozen, his eyes wide, his lips parted, as if the words couldn't reach him. I'm free," he whispered, not to the room, but to Danielle. Danielle's eyes filled with tears. A smile crept slowly across her face, a smile filled with everything: relief, pride, exhaustion, love. She pulled him into a tight embrace. "You're free, Malcolm," she whispered, voice thick. "But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Behind the bench, Judge Graves banged his gavel once, twice. "Order. This courtroom will come to order." But even he couldn't mask the irritation in his tone. He had lost control of the narrative, of the room, and everyone knew it. Danielle released Malcolm just enough to place her hands on his shoulders, grounding him, looking into his eyes. "We fought. We won. But now we fight for others." Malcolm nodded, his face still stunned, but his posture no longer slouched. There was strength returning to him, a flicker of purpose behind the eyes that had once gone dim. Reporters gathered outside like bees at a hive, microphones, cameras, flashes. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Inside the courtroom, it was just Malcolm, Danielle, and the truth finally allowed to breathe. It didn't take long for the story to spread. Headlines lit up phones and tablets before the courtroom even emptied. Man found not guilty after video reveals. Police misconduct. Secret Service agent stuns courtroom in defense of brother. Bodycam footage exposes excessive force. Clips of the courtroom, Danielle holding her badge, the jury reading the verdict, went viral. People weren't just watching, they were reacting. The officer involved in Malcolm's arrest was placed on administrative leave, pending internal investigation. Protests formed outside the precinct, not angry but focused. Handmade signs reading, "Justice for Malcolm Brooks. Truth is a weapon. Stop silencing us." The moment had become a movement. For Danielle Brooks, the days that followed were a whirlwind. Reporters, activists, legal panels. Everyone wanted to hear from the woman who had stood up to power and won. In one nationally broadcast interview, a journalist asked, "Agent Brooks, you didn't just fight for your brother. You fought for something bigger. What message do you want people to take from this?" Danielle paused, looked directly into the camera. "What happened to Malcolm is part of a much larger problem," she said. "This isn't just about one man or one courtroom. It's about what kind of justice we're willing to accept. Because accountability isn't optional. And truth, it's not negotiable." Her words echoed across newsrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across the country. Clips of her testimony were used in law school discussions. Churches replayed her closing words. Youth programs invited her to speak, and she did every time. "This isn't just about pointing fingers," she told one community forum. It's about building a system where power serves people, not the other way around. Malcolm Brooks, now a free man, watched from the sidelines at first, still trying to process it all. But the more he watched his sister speak, the more something inside him shifted. He saw the strength he thought he'd lost, not just in her, but now, reflected in himself. He started speaking too, not as a victim, but as a man who had survived, and now wanted to help others do the same. And then came the night of the big speech. The auditorium was packed. Hundreds of faces stared up at Danielle Brooks as she stood under the lights, calm and confident, the echoes of applause from her introduction still hanging in the air. She looked out at them. Every race, every age, all gathered for one reason: truth. She took a breath. When I walked into that courtroom, she began, I wasn't just defending my brother. I was standing up to a system that too often forgets the very people it's supposed to protect. The room was quiet, hanging on every word. I was told I didn't matter, that the facts didn't matter, that my voice didn't matter, but I knew better. She paused. Justice doesn't happen by default. It doesn't happen by luck. It happens when ordinary people decide to do something extraordinary. Heads nodded, eyes brimmed, and truth. It's not always comfortable, but without it, there is no justice, no fairness, no hope. She let the silence settle, then said, slowly, firmly, my brother's case was just one. There are hundreds more, voices we haven't heard, stories we haven't seen. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Another pause, and then with unwavering conviction. Change doesn't start in Washington. It starts with us, right here, right now. The room stood. Applause thundered. Not just clapping, believing. Danielle stepped back, eyes shining, heart full. For the first time, she felt the ripples of change beginning to spread. Was Judge Graves wrong? Yes. His ego clouded his judgment. Was Marcus Lowell unethical? Without a doubt, he knew the truth and buried it. But why did they act that way? Because they believed they could, because the system lets them, until someone calls them out. That someone was Danielle. And that's the lesson. Never underestimate the power of one woman, standing tall with nothing but the truth. If this story stirred something in you, don't just keep scrolling. Subscribe to Black Women for more stories that fight back, speak up, and demand justice. Drop a comment below. Have you ever seen injustice up close? What did you do? What would you do? Because change starts with stories, and stories start with us.